no dominant power in the international order has ever had as much voluntary assistance as the United States gets from its allies. What really worries me for the duration of the Trump administration and beyond is they don't seem to be concerned about whether allies are going to help us for things we need help on. You don't get to the economy of scale and military forces for managing China without allied assistance. And if I were an American ally having to worry about, for the first time in a long time, protection of my own territory without American help, I wouldn't have a lot of time for helping the United States elsewhere.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we revisit our favorite guests, our favorite topics, our favorite military alliances, and our favorite inspirational quotes. Back many, many moons ago, and more than 1.5 million downloads ago, in episode 6, NATO, a model for ordering the disorder, we heard many pearls of wisdom, such as, NATO is the place we run to when we are scared, and how standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies gives America strength in the world, and how when America steps forward, other countries are emboldened to lead, and when we step backward, our allies cower. We also heard about how NATO is a value and an ideal as much as it is a military alliance. These are inspirational sentiments, and they contain concepts that are worth revisiting and re-examining in light of our new reality. It's a great honor and pleasure to have back on the podcast Kori Schake, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute and former NATO desk officer at the U.S. Department of Defense under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. She has been a conservative foreign policy thinker and someone who was director for defense strategy and requirements on the NSC during George W. Bush's first term. So she brings real conservative chops to addressing the state of where America is and where America's commitments are in the world. Therefore, as you will hear, it is all the more shocking for her to point out that there is nothing conservative that this Republican administration is doing, and nothing that traditional neocon McCainite Republicans recognize in this administration's agenda. I've talked about it before, which is that the first administration had some neocons and some conservative archcons in it. The McMasters, even Rex Tillerson as a kind of traditional conservative. Now the neocons and the archcons have been gutted, and we have only isolationist and neo-populists and MAGA Bannonites in the foreign policy positions. So to look at America's role in the world from a more conservative perspective than we usually do, welcome back to the Disorder Podcast, Kori Schake.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure, my friend.
So let's talk about this administration's Make America Great Again agenda. We both know where we stand, but I want to ask you, if there was a nonpartisan alien from Mars who had come down to Earth in early April and was asked to evaluate the first 11 weeks of Trump administration policy on national security interests, what are the things that this nonpartisan Martian might say are working well?
One thing that I think the administration is doing well is forcing every agency of the government, including the Department of Defense, to identify and reduce excessive or wasteful spending. It's always been a mystery to me why people think the Pentagon spends money well, but the rest of the government doesn't, because it's just manifestly untrue. And so taking a fresh look across the departments, and particularly across the national security departments, to make sure that the money that's being spent there actually needs to be spent there. For example, Elaine McCusker, my colleague at AEI, did a terrific study last year. She was the former acting comptroller of the Defense Department, and she went through the entire J-book, DoD's line-by-line budget, and she categorized all of the spending into 4 possible categories. Things directly necessary for fighting and winning the nation's wars, things that keep the people we need to fight and win the nation's wars in the force. Third category is sort of on the margin, and a fourth category was things that just have nothing to do with fighting and winning the nation's wars. Things like breast cancer research or electric vehicles, many of which are good things, but $1 in 7 in the defense budget goes to that category of spending. So you could claw back $108 billion of buying power for the Department of Defense by funding those things in other parts of the budget where they belong.
I heard you speak on the What the Hell podcast that we're going to put a link to in the show notes with Danielle Pletka about how our NATO allies frequently put a lot of programs in what they call defense spending to boost the percentage up to the 2% mark, because there are a whole range of political reasons that you want something to count as defense spending. So that really resonates with me, that you want to call a spade a spade. Back to our pretend alien observer, might she conclude that withdrawing American coordination in some aspects could have a genius way of bringing the EU, UK, and Canada closer together, and that this could be mystically forcing some kind of positives in global order by kicking our allies to get their act together?
So, yes, I believe she could, provided that she doesn't do a net assessment of what's being destroyed in order to produce that positive outcome of greater European and Canadian cooperation. Because the first 11 weeks of the Trump administration have pretty well destroyed 80 years of confidence in American security guarantees, in American reliability as the leader of the global economy, and American trustworthiness that any deal made with us can stick.
Yes, we've come back down to earth right away. And the fascinating thing about both deterrence and leadership is that it's about reliability. In other words, deterrence works when people believe that they will be deterred, and leadership works when you're like, we can trust on this individual. So although this episode is going to be airing in mid-April, we're speaking one day post-Liberation Day. And, of course, Liberation Day is the name that the administration has given the day of the announcement of its tariffs on a range of different countries. In your understanding, what does the administration seek to liberate America from?
From any connection to the rest of the global economy, near as I can tell. I mean, I make a practice of not using Trump White House characterizations of their own policies because I feel like that gives them credit they don't merit on the policies themselves. And the notion that tariffs aren't taxes on American consumers, but somehow magically are a penalty on foreign producers. You know,
it bucks nearly a century of
did none of these guys take Econ 1 in college?
Yes. Speaking of more realities, let's talk about the desire of the Trump administration to not appoint a SAC Corps and to buck another multi-decade-long tradition where the chief military officer for NATO in Europe is an American. What do you understand about that decision, where it's come from, what its implications are?
So I don't think they've made a decision yet, but they are considering it under a review of American global posture of military forces and commitments. And what they're trying to do is reduce American commitments and American forces in Europe. But Congress has a say in that and has already fired a warning shot. Senator Wicker, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and his Democratic counterpart, Senator Jack Reed, have already sent a letter to the president reminding him that Congress has a role to play, a controlling role to play on this. So it's an open question whether it's going to happen. Secretary Rubio was in Brussels for the NATO foreign ministers meeting at the start of April, and he scolded the press corps for mysteriously believing that President Trump wasn't a supporter of NATO, which, again, the president himself has said enough times he might not defend NATO allies. And unless they did what he wanted on defense spending, Russia could do whatever they want. So America's European allies and North American allies are quite right to be doubting the Trump administration's commitment to America's treaty obligations.
That's certainly the conventional wisdom. To push back slightly, the Finnish prime minister was interviewed on the margins of Rubio's Brussels visit, and others who say, no, we understand that the Trump administration is committed to NATO, and we thought it was good that Rubio talked about 5% of GDP spending. And
the U.S. spends 3.2% of GDP. So I hope if the president's going to commit to 5% for NATO allies, he will take American defense spending up there because we need it for our own obligations. But I don't think that's what they mean. I think what they mean is, and we're seeing this as a pattern of Trump administration behavior, that they want to impose standards on others that they don't want the United States to have to meet.
And very zero-sum, or what I would even call negative-sum thinking, which is that rather than we all win together, there's a zero-sum. If I can offload this onto you, then we won't have to, whatever. And that's not the way that, of course, alliances work.
That's absolutely right, Jason. They are burning through American soft power like a forest fire. And what they seem genuinely not to understand is that no dominant power in the international order has ever had as much voluntary assistance as the United States gets from its allies. We get that not just because allies like us, although historically allies have liked us, but also because we created an international order that gives small and medium-sized states an ability to affect the rules, to change the rules, to help enforce the rules, and there hasn't been a better deal for small and medium-sized countries. So that draws them into the American orbit of influence, and because Luxembourg gets as many votes at NATO as the United States does, Luxembourg voluntarily helps the United States on a whole range of things. What really worries me for the duration of the Trump administration and beyond, because they are making choices that are going to affect allies' judgments for a generation. And what worries me is they don't seem to be concerned about whether allies are going to help us for things we need help on. You don't get to the economy of scale and military forces for managing China without allied assistance. And if I were an American ally having to worry about, for the first time in a long time, protection of my own territory without American help, I wouldn't have a lot of time for helping the United States elsewhere.
And it would be really difficult to tackle the new challenges such as AI regulation, the AI race with China. And
that's a great point.
Our relationships, particularly with the UK, where they're trying to carve themselves out as an AI power, or the EU, where they really like their role as tech regulators. Maybe not the ability to produce tech the way that Silicon Valley can, but they're important in regulating that tech. And how are we going to coordinate with them when we're having these other fights?
Exactly. And if we start treating our European allies as adversaries, what incentive will they have to allow data to be held on American servers, to allow American tech companies to operate in Europe? We justifiably get frustrated with EU regulation on American businesses, but it is lighter than it otherwise would be because of our friendship, our economic partnerships, and our security relationships that President Trump is now reconfiguring in a way that maximizes American leverage over others. You know, historically, that's what leads to balancing against a dominant power.
100%. I mean, I like how you introduced the kind of balance of power notion, because if we look at British foreign policy from the Napoleonic Wars until World War I, you know, the question of Belgian neutrality, but beyond that, the balance of power itself was what drove British grand strategic thinking about the European continent. France could have been a threat until 1904 and then an ally after 1904, but as one rose, they needed to counterbalance. America has been the dominant military power in Europe since 1946. A great statistic is that America has had more combat troops than any European country on the European continent at any one time. So we have been the dominant, literally military power, even inside Germany. Mm-hmm. And that is possible because the Germans allow it. They don't kick us out of Ramstein. They allow us to run AFRICOM in Stuttgart. And
they allow us to run the Landstuhl Hospital, which is where American soldiers injured and coalition soldiers injured in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria get taken for treatment.
And if all of a sudden you're a European head of state thinking, oh, we need to start balancing against the U.S. presence, that's a blow to our global prestige like we haven't had in our lifetimes.
Absolutely. And not just our prestige, it's a blow to our global power. I am deeply skeptical whether the United States can remain a great power without the support of its allies.
We were talking about the loss of American soft power, and I'm wondering from an intelligence community perspective, because Five Eyes is so much at the core of what makes the Anglosphere special. When I used to go to Libya every year, I was shocked to find out that the European ambassador, in other words, the head of the European External Action Service, who is like Brussels ambassador, doesn't get the intel briefings from the Quai d'Orsay and from the Farnesina. The EEAS has to have intel from Brussels. And as you might know, Brussels doesn't have an intelligence agency. So they don't, for example, say, oh, we're seeing more Tebu smuggling gold south of Kufra. That's not something that body can know. And the Europeans don't share that information with their own European ambassador. And when I had that realization as a graduate student, I was like, wow, Five Eyes brings Australia and New Zealand closer on intel matters to the CIA and the Pentagon than Italy is to France and Brussels. This is somehow magical. Is there a risk potentially with, for example, statements about Canada, which obviously if you're sitting in Keir Starmer's position and then you find yourself at GCHQ, you might be worried that your Commonwealth partner might be having its core interests threatened by your Five Eyes ally. Could this risk the kind of magic of Anglosphere intelligence sharing?
Absolutely. I would not be surprised to see the Trump administration attempt to expel Canada from Five Eyes intel sharing.
That would just be the death of Five Eyes, essentially.
I don't think it would be the death of Five Eyes, but it would be a bad thing.
Would the British be willing to participate with us after such an action?
The British wouldn't like it, but the Five Eyes sharing is enormously important for Britain's own security. So the country who has the greatest leverage is Australia because of satellite downlinks and other technical things going on in Australia.
And also because, as I understand it, each of the five develops niches, and the Australian niche vis-a-vis China is something that we probably value.
Australia is a frontline state, and so absolutely. The Australians were the first to understand why Huawei equipment was problematic in Western infrastructure. The first Trump administration got a lot of attention for the threats they were making, but all of us learned it from Australia. And so we will get dumber if we expel any of the Five Eyes. And the Trump administration is acting as though we are the only provider and everybody else is the beneficiary. And that's just simply not true. It's not
Particularly
true.
because Britain punches above its weight in
It's
intelligence.
not true with the Five Eyes countries. It's not true with other countries with whom we have intelligence relationships. Very often, our allies understand local and regional issues much better than the American intelligence community does.
Yeah, you wrote a great article in The Atlantic, which we're going to put in the show notes, where you spoke about other threats to the American intelligence community, such as the career-terminating buyouts of CIA employees. You know, it's been a few weeks since you've written that article. Do you see, as part of all of these buyouts and the Doge whirlwind weeping through institutions, are there any ripple effects already from this?
Yeah, a whole bunch of talented people are leaving government service, right? Then number two at the Health and Human Services Department just resigned in protest over the corruption of data. And, you know, if you were an American intelligence officer and you watched the director of Central Intelligence or the director of National Intelligence lie under oath to the Congress that there was no classified information in that signal chat, you know, it's not just America's allied intelligence services that are nervous. American intelligence officers are nervous, and they should be.
And speaking of Signalgate, could it be that our adversaries are already inside some of our sensitive communications?
Of course they
already?
are. Of course they are. Yes. I mean, the Trump administration is a counterintelligence bonanza for America's enemies. That those 19 senior administration officials were all using Signal, which is secure for a commercial platform. But even having the commercial platform on their phones should be prevented by good practice of preservation of
You're preaching to
classified
the choir.
intelligence.
So what would it mean, kind of blue sky thinking, for our adversaries to potentially be inside our comms the way that maybe, you know, we in the past have listened to Merkel's phone calls?
So it's not just that they can read your texts and listen to your telephone calls. They can see all of your contacts that are listed. They can track your physical location. They can figure out where you live. They can figure out your bank details. I mean, so much data mining because all of us are so dependent on our telephones.
After the break, we'll be back with Kori Schake to hear about her fascinating theory about how the Trump cabinet is a cabinet of megaphones. So moving beyond Signalgate to just understanding this new administration on its own terms, you're an astute historian of the presidency and the executive as an institution. And you wrote something that really resonated with me, and we're going to put a link to that article in the show notes, which is that we've moved from a cabinet of rivals model, Obama bringing in Hillary to be Secretary of State, or, for example, Trump 1, where he had to deal with McMaster, and he had to deal with Mark Milley and others who were quite constitutionally different than him, to the cabinet as megaphone model. Many people have explained this as we're seeing a reality TV show administration, but I actually like the way that you put it better, because cabinet as megaphone and kind of loyalty oath shows that there is a PR exercise happening within a given institution rather than a policy exercise. Maybe you could expand on this thought process.
I think that's exactly right. I really like the way you just phrased that. I think the moment when it should have become clear to all of us was at the end of the meeting in the Oval Office where the president and vice president humiliated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And it's so instructive that the president was all excited and said, this is going to be great television. If you look at how President Trump spends his time, every single day he wants video of him sitting behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, fielding questions from reporters. So what you see the cabinet doing is trying to produce equivalent content for the president. So Secretary of Defense doing push-ups with Navy SEALs, that kind of stuff, and trying to figure out where the president is on policy and running faster than the president to get there. So being out in front of the president on what you think the president wants is a very different model of a cabinet. They're not policy advisors. They're not independent political forces whose threat of resignation a president has to worry about. What they are is amplifiers of what they think the president wants.
I find this very compelling, and I want to give an example from my own experiences and my own research. If we look at Libya in the Gaddafi period, it differed a lot from other Arab nationalist states. So that if you look at, say, Ba'athi Syria or Ba'athi Iraq or Nasser's Egypt, it didn't have this dynamic that I'm about to explain. Gaddafi was a true believer in his own ideology, so that as he progressed from, say, being an Arab nationalist socialist to then having his green book, and he would make a speech, for example, abolishing the renting of apartments. As soon as that would happen, parts of the Libyan bureaucracy would expropriate properties and do things before he had even announced the policies on that. And one of the things that resonated with me in this idea of a cabinet of megaphones is that in a race for not just ideological purity, but getting out in front of the boss, you create a dynamic where an idea gets very quickly amplified to its logical conclusion.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm not a great economist, and I don't know what Peter Navarro or Lutnick,
who are also not great economists.
Sure, but they are ideologues on tariffs. They've been writing about it for decades, and you have to give it to them. This isn't something they came up with yesterday. They genuinely have this idea. But what I understand is happening one day post-Liberation Day is Trump articulated some inchoate ideas on tariffs, but they were quite extreme in their economic dislocation, but they were articulated as principles. And then the people who want those principles are like, great, I can even go much, much further, because there's a desire to amplify potentially disordering implications out of a PR exercise, out of an ideological purity exercise. And I think it's important to signal to the mega orderers how different this is than Trump 1.0, because the Trump 1.0 phenomenon, to use Kori's excellent terminology, was constrained via a cabinet of rivals. In other words, if Tillerson was going to resign, it would have some ripple effects. People wanted to constrain him. And now there's a different dynamic, maybe more like ideological authoritarian regimes. I won't use the word dictatorships, but ideological authoritarians rather than fascist authoritarians or military authoritarians. There's an ideological desire, and I believe that the neo-populist aspects of the Trump administration will now go towards their more natural extremes on things like immigration and tariffs.
That's really interesting. I think you're right.
It's terrifying, but it's interesting. So we could have a whole other podcast on this phenomenon, but I think it can tie into the question of engagement with Russia. And this is something I want to probe you on, because I really value your multi-decade engagement on this. We saw early in Trump 2.0 that America had stopped offensive cyber against Russia. We've then seen that the FBI has closed the Foreign Influence Task Force. Would you agree with me that these are not things that the president or Susan Wiles are directly intervening in, but people around them say, this is the kind of thing the boss would want?
Yeah, I think that's right. And President Trump very often, when confronted by people in the media about specific policy actions, denies he knows anything about it. So he either doesn't know about it or he's happy to kick whoever did it overboard once it starts being politically costly. But I do think there is a very strong trend by President Trump personally pushing the administration to give Russia a better bargain than Ukraine on the war. I mean, Russia wasn't listed as having any tariffs applied to it in the tariff scheme, which is just, I think it's indicative.
Signaling. So as these things move towards their logical extremes, there's going to be a lot of disorder. Kori, how can we order the disorder? I want to think from a conservative, traditional, American strength in the world perspective about ways that people sitting outside the policy process can try to order the disorder. Could there be some inadvertent ordering going on, which is that our European allies and East Asian allies are maybe so terrified now that they would forge something like a G6 to coordinate together and really share information and create military interoperability? Could you see, Mark Carney as this mega orderer? Can there be these inadvertent gains?
There could be. I'm skeptical that it would happen overtly because that would likely draw reprisals from the United States. But I assume it's already going on, and they're not doing their jobs very well if it's not already going on. But what you also see is the beginning of America's allies balancing against American power. Japan and South Korea opening trade negotiations with China, for example. The CTPTP, I always get that wrong.
It's impossible to say on air.
What the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership has become
yes.
Now that it's comprehensive and the U.S. isn't part of it. China applied to join that could well be admitted into a bloc that the United States chose not to remain part of. And I think that's what we're likely to see. Institutionalization and multilateral cooperation among other countries that excludes the United States.
What settlement should an American administration seek in Ukraine? I mean, all these talks about ceasefire and not peace and not ceasefire. If you could beam a policy idea, because it's going to have to be only 2 to 3 bullet points, that's all they ever read in this administration, what should they actually be going for?
What they should actually be going for is the restoration of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, because that will only happen if Russia loses. And the only way the war's not going to continue is if Russia loses. Not just because Ukrainians will continue to fight, as they should for their freedom, but also unless Russia loses, they will just pause, rearm, and re-engage. So the only stable outcome is Russia actually losing.
And it's fascinating. You remind me of the 2 people that we've spoken to on the pod who've had the most moral clarity. And I'm referencing Bill Browder and Evgenia Karamurza, both of whom, like you, speak in simple words, but with such clarity of moral purpose, and they come to exactly the same conclusion as you. And I want to say from your mouth to God's ears, it's so great having these chats, and I hope we can have you back in 2026.
Thank you, my friend.
Wow, I would like to have a bipartisan alliance with some of these traditional McCainian, Romney-style Republicans. I never thought I would say a sentence like that, but listening to Kori makes me long for those days. If you long for the days of an ordered world where bipartisan legislation to defeat the Soviet Union or get WMDs or work with our European allies or see moral clarity in standing up against Russia, if you want something like that, please subscribe to our Substack and pay for it. I have to push for this because, my dear listeners, we don't break even making this pod. It's extremely expensive. So we need you to support us, and that allows us to do the activities and bring you these great guests like Bill Browder and Kori Schake and to hear that moral clarity. So please follow the link in the show notes, subscribe to the Substack, upgrade to paid, get some bonus content. For example, I'm going to have one about what is going on in Doge and how there is a trench warfare against the Dogistas. And if you love the kind of content we do, you must join me in thanking the mega orderer-in-chief, our producer, George McDonough, and our fantastic executive producer, Neil Fern. I am wishing you a week free from disorder where you can stand shoulder to shoulder with your allies and support the greatest military alliance in human history. Enjoy the week. Go NATO! Mega orderers, I need many podcasts these days, not just to hear the rapid-fire news, but to break down how could all this be happening to us. And someone I turn to is Jordan Harbinger. His show was previously named one of Apple's best. We had him on episode 69, Life in North Korea, Kidnapping Stories, and Why Symbolism Matters with Dictators. And that pretty much tells you all you need to know about how the Jordan Harbinger show works. He has deep dive interviews dealing with things like psychology, self-help. He might talk to an FBI negotiator about trust. And he draws on some of our top table disorder guests like Anne Applebaum to think about why disorderers like Iran and Russia can work together. I'm sure you'll love it. So search The Jordan Harbinger Show wherever you get your podcasts.